I showed up to my father Desmond's lavish retirement party at an exclusive Atlanta country club, only to hear the whispers echoing through the ballroom. There is the frigid daughter who cannot do anything right. Then my stepmother Vivica looked me up and down and sneered. Security removed this useless woman. I left silently, got into my car, and moved my $20 million into a blind trust. Within minutes, I had 60 missed calls, and they were pounding on my penthouse door. My name is Iman. I am 32 years old, and I am about to show you what happens when the family scapegoat becomes the landlord of their entire lives. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been the black sheep who quietly built an empire while your family prayed for your downfall. Growing up in the affluent circles of Atlanta, image was everything. My father Desmond spent his life climbing the ranks as an investment banker obsessed with status country club memberships and maintaining the perfect facade of the black elite. When my biological mother passed away, he quickly married Vivica, a woman who cared more about designer labels and charity galas than she ever cared about me. Then came my half-sister Sydney, the undisputed golden child who could do no wrong. I was the dark cloud in their sunny world. I preferred coding and building software over attending cotillions. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration of my father stepping down from his firm. The ballroom of the Buckhead Country Club was dripping in crystal chandeliers, white orchids, and champagne towers. I arrived wearing a custom Prada gown, quiet and understated, carrying a carefully wrapped retirement gift. I approached the main family table where my father sat like a king holding court. Before I could even offer a word of congratulations, Vivica leaned across the table toward a wealthy pastor's wife, deliberately raising her voice so everyone nearby could hear. "Look at what dragged itself in." Vivica laughed, a sharp, grating sound. "I cannot believe Iman had the nerve to wear a thrift store dress to her father's retirement gala. It is simply embarrassing how she refuses to present herself with any class." I stood there, the heavy gift box in my hands, feeling the collective gaze of Atlanta's most influential people burning into my skin. I did not flinch. Sydney, sitting beside her husband Preston, rolled her eyes and took a sip of her champagne. "Do not mind her, babe," Sydney whispered loudly to Preston, making sure the entire table caught every syllable. "She is the one who flunked out of Howard University. Daddy had to cut her off completely because she wanted to make stupid little budget apps instead of going to law school like a normal person. It is honestly pathetic that she is still trying to get his attention." Preston, a 30-year-old wealth manager who wore his arrogance like cheap cologne, let out a condescending chuckle. He was a white man who had married into our family specifically for the status and connections my father provided. Preston managed my father's massive portfolio and never missed an opportunity to remind me of my place. He leaned back in his chair, looking at me with pure disdain. "Listen to your old man," Iman Preston said, swirling his drink. "Some of us actually handle millions of dollars a day. We deal with real clients, real money, and real businesses. Why do not you leave the adults to their work and go back to your little computer games?" His sheer audacity almost made me laugh. Preston had no idea that the massive anonymous trust account he had been mismanaging at his firm for the past 3 years, the very account that earned him his recent promotion and funded his lavish lifestyle with Sydney, belonged entirely to me. I had built a financial technology platform from the ground up, scaled it globally, and sold it to a massive conglomerate just last month. My budget apps, as Sydney so eloquently called them, had made me a multimillionaire. But they did not know that. To them, I was still the 20-year-old girl they had thrown out into the rain with nothing but a laptop and a suitcase. Desmond finally turned to look at me. His eyes were completely devoid of warmth. There was no fatherly affection, no glimmer of regret for the years we had lost. He adjusted his expensive tuxedo jacket and glared at me as if I were a stranger who had wandered in off the street. "I will not have a useless daughter ruining my night," he announced, his deep voice carrying over the music. "I just formally announced that Preston is taking over my entire financial legacy. You have no place here. Security remove this woman from the premises immediately." Two large men in dark suits stepped from the shadows, placing their heavy hands on my arms. The pastor's wife gasped, covering her mouth in feigned shock, while Vivica smiled triumphantly behind her champagne flute. Sydney and Preston exchanged a look of pure, unadulterated satisfaction. They expected me to cry. They expected me to beg for my father's love, to cause a scene, or to run away in shame just like I had done all those years ago. Instead, I felt a deep, radiating sense of calm wash over me. I gently but firmly shook off the security guard's hands. I adjusted my coat and looked directly at the family who had spent a lifetime trying to break me. A slow smile spread across my face as I reached into my clutch. I was not reaching for a tissue to wipe away tears. My fingers closed around the cold, heavy metal of a sleek titanium black card. The game was finally over, and it was time to show them exactly who owned the board. I showed up to my father's lavish retirement party hearing whispers, calling me a frigid daughter who cannot do anything right. My stepmother sneered, telling security to remove this useless woman. I left silently, moving $20 million into a blind trust. Soon I had 60 missed calls and they were pounding on my door. I am Iman, 32 years old, and I will show you what happens when the family scapegoat becomes the landlord of their entire lives. Before I continue, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever built an empire while your family prayed for your downfall. Growing up in affluent Atlanta, image was everything. My father Desmond climbed the ranks as an investment banker, obsessed with status and maintaining the perfect facade of the black elite. When my biological mother died, he married Vivica, a woman who cared more about designer labels than she ever cared about me. Then came my half-sister Sydney, the golden child who could do no wrong. I preferred coding software over attending cotillions. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration of my father stepping down from his firm. The Buckhead Country Club ballroom was dripping in crystal chandeliers, white orchids, and champagne towers. I arrived wearing a custom gown, carrying a wrapped retirement gift. I stopped behind my father's chair. Desmond did not bother to turn around. He kept his eyes locked on Preston, nodding approvingly at whatever arrogant anecdote his son-in-law was sharing. I took a slow breath and extended the velvet box. "Happy retirement, Dad." I spoke clearly, ensuring my voice carried over the soft jazz. "I wanted to congratulate you on your legacy." Desmond finally turned his head. His eyes dropped to the velvet box in my hand, then flicked up to my face with sheer disgust. He did not say a word. He raised his hand and violently swatted my arm away. The box flew from my grasp, hitting the polished marble floor with a sharp crack. The velvet hinge snapped open and the expensive watch skittered across the floor, coming to rest against a nearby waiter's shoe. The entire table went dead silent. The clinking of champagne flutes ceased. Sydney masked a delighted smirk, while Vivica let out a soft, theatrical gasp of manufactured pity. Vivica leaned over to the pastor's wife, loudly whispering about how tragic it was that I lacked basic social grace. Desmond stood up slowly, adjusting his tuxedo cuffs. He tapped his crystal glass with a silver spoon, commanding the attention of the entire room. "Ladies and gentlemen," Desmond announced, his voice booming across the ballroom, "tonight is about building a legacy. It is about generational wealth and ensuring that what we build is passed down to capable hands." He gestured toward Preston, who puffed out his chest and offered a humble nod to the applauding crowd. "That is why I am incredibly proud to officially announce that my son-in-law Preston will take over my entire financial portfolio and assume my seat as senior managing partner. He has proven himself to be a brilliant mind in wealth management, revitalizing our firm with a massive influx of anonymous capital." The room erupted into polite, enthusiastic applause. Sydney clapped the loudest, flashing her diamond rings for the photographer hovering nearby. Desmond waited for the clapping to subside before his gaze snapped back to me, cold and unyielding. "But building a legacy also means pruning the dead weight," he continued, abandoning his cheerful tone. It means recognizing when someone has chosen the path of failure and refusing to let them drag down the family name. He pointed a rigid finger at my face. I will not have a useless daughter ruining my night. I will not allow someone who threw away every opportunity I gave her, someone who brings embarrassment to this family, to stand here and poison this celebration. You chose to be a failure the day you dropped out of university to play around with meaningless software. You do not belong in this room, and you certainly do not belong at this table. He snapped his fingers toward the back of the room. Security, remove this woman from the premises immediately. Two security guards in dark suits detached themselves from the walls and began marching toward our table. The humiliation was designed to reduce me to a sobbing, hysterical mess right there in front of the city's most powerful figures. They wanted me to beg for my father's validation, just like I had done when I was 20 years old. Preston leaned back in his chair, swirling the last sip of his vintage champagne. He let out a loud, mocking laugh that cut through the heavy silence. Listen to your old man, Iman, Preston sneered with arrogant superiority. Some of us actually handle millions of dollars a day. We deal with real clients, real money, and real businesses. Your father spent his entire life building an empire, and I am the one multiplying it. Leave the adults to their work and go back to your little computer games. Maybe you can code yourself a virtual invitation to the next party because you are certainly not welcome at this one. The security guards reached me, grabbing my arms. I did not fight them. I calmly shook off their hands, adjusting my coat with perfect composure. My sheer confidence made them hesitate. I leaned down, placing both hands on the table, and brought my face inches from Preston's ear. You handle millions, Preston, I whispered smoothly. Check your largest anonymous account in 5 minutes. I walked out of the grand ballroom with my head held high, the sharp sound of my designer heels clicking against the polished marble, serving as the perfect steady countdown to their absolute financial destruction. Tonight was the very beginning of my entirely new, massive financial empire, and their absolute, incredibly tragic, irreversible end. The heavy mahogany doors of the Buckhead Country Club swung shut behind me, muting the jazz music and the self-congratulatory chatter of Atlanta's elite. My stiletto heels struck the polished marble of the grand foyer with a sharp, rhythmic cadence, a steady metronome marking the final seconds of Preston's career. The cool night air hit my face as I stepped out from under the grand portico. The valet, recognizing me, immediately scrambled to open the heavy rear door of my waiting armored Maybach. I slid into the plush leather interior, the cabin utterly silent, insulated from the toxic world I had just walked away from. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water from the console, my hands completely steady. There was no adrenaline rush, no erratic heartbeat. I was a surgeon about to make the final fatal incision. I picked up my phone and dialed a private number. It rang exactly once before a crisp, authoritative voice answered. I am ready, Sterling, I said, staring out the tinted window as the country club faded into the distance. Sterling, my lead attorney and chief financial architect, had been waiting by his secure terminal for this exact call. He knew the history. He knew about the college tuition Desmond had drained. He knew about the times Vivica had locked me out of the house. And he knew exactly how Preston had built his entire false reputation on the back of my anonymous success. Give the order, Iman Sterling replied, his fingers already audible against a mechanical keyboard. Pull the $20 million out of the Apex Blind Trust, I commanded, my voice devoid of emotion. Liquidate the domestic holdings and transfer the entire balance to the offshore corporate accounts immediately. I want it in the Caymans before my father finishes his dessert. Sterling chuckled, a low, dangerous sound. Initiating the transfer sequence now. Security protocols bypassed. Capital is moving. What about his leverage positions? Trigger the margin calls, I said, leaning back into the leather seat. Preston has been illegally borrowing against my capital to cover Desmond's bad trades and fund Sydney's shopping sprees. He thought my account was a dormant safety net. Rip the net away. Let gravity do the rest. Back inside the glittering ballroom, the celebration was reaching its peak. Desmond was standing at the head of the table, a fresh glass of vintage champagne in hand, basking in the glow of his peers. He was a man who believed he had successfully purged the only stain from his perfect family portrait. Beside him, Preston was holding court surrounded by junior partners and wealthy congregants. Preston adjusted his silk tie, leaning in to tell a joke about how easy it was to manipulate the current market when you had real generational wealth backing you up. Sydney was busy recording a live video for her followers, panning the camera to show off the floral arrangements and her diamond necklace, completely oblivious to the financial earthquake rumbling directly beneath her designer shoes. Vivica was already planning her next country club luncheon, whispering to the pastor's wife about how my departure was a blessing in disguise, a necessary cleansing of the family's social standing. They were all suffocating in their own arrogance, convinced that they were untouchable, convinced that I was nothing more than a pathetic memory fading into the Atlanta night. They had built their entire identities on the assumption that I would always be beneath them. In the back of the Maybach, my phone pinged with a secure encrypted confirmation. $20 million had successfully cleared international waters. The domestic trust was completely hollowed out, leaving behind a gaping financial crater that no amount of country club networking could ever fill. Transfer complete, Sterling announced over the line. The account is at zero. The automated risk management systems at Preston's firm have just detected the catastrophic liquidity drop. The margin calls are officially firing. His entire house of cards is collapsing as we speak. He is going to need a miracle to avoid federal indictment by morning. Thank you, Sterling, I said softly. Keep your phone on. They will be looking for me very soon. I ended the call and watched the city lights blur past the window, a genuine smile finally touching my lips. Inside the ballroom, Preston raised his glass to make a toast. He opened his mouth to boast about the massive quarter his firm was projecting, ready to take full credit for the phantom millions he thought he controlled. But before the first word could escape his lips, his wrist vibrated. He glanced down, annoyed at the interruption. His Apple Watch screen was glowing brightly in the dim light of the ballroom. It was a high-priority automated alert from his firm's central compliance server. Critical liquidity failure. Account Apex 001 balance depleted. Preston blinked, his brow furrowing in confusion. He shook his wrist, assuming it was a software glitch, but then his watch vibrated again and again, a relentless, violent buzzing that sent a sudden jolt of panic through his chest. He reached into his tuxedo jacket and pulled out his phone. The screen was a chaotic waterfall of red notifications. Margin call triggered. Asset deficit detected. Unauthorized leverage exposed. Immediate action required. The color drained from Preston's face so rapidly he looked as though he had been physically struck. The smug, superior grin vanished, replaced by an expression of sheer, unadulterated terror. His hands began to shake uncontrollably. The champagne flute slipped from his fingers, shattering against the marble floor and splashing expensive wine across Sydney's designer gown. Sydney shrieked, jumping back and swatting at her dress. "Preston, what is wrong with you? Look what you just did to my silk." Preston did not hear her. He could not hear the jazz music or the hushed murmurs of the guests staring at his sudden outburst. He was staring at a new notification, a direct text message from his firm's senior managing partner, the exact man he was supposed to impress tonight. The message contained only 4 words. "What did you do?" He looked wildly toward the grand mahogany doors where I had exited just minutes before. My whisper echoed in his mind like a death knell. "Check your largest anonymous account in 5 minutes." The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. The phantom tech billionaire he had been leeching off of the silent client who had single-handedly built his career was the same black woman his father-in-law had just ordered security to throw out like trash. He was financially ruined, legally exposed, and facing federal prison for unauthorized leveraging. He stumbled backward, knocking his chair to the floor, gasping for air as the full weight of his destruction crashed down upon him. 2 hours had passed since I walked out of that country club. The transition from the suffocating perfumed air of that ballroom to the crisp, absolute sanctuary of my penthouse was everything I needed. I stood in the center of my kitchen, the sprawling Atlanta skyline glittering like scattered diamonds through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows. The air up here was thin, quiet, and entirely my own. I reached for the matte black kettle, listening to the soft, comforting hiss of boiling water. I poured it slowly into a porcelain mug, watching the dark amber ribbons of tea swirl and bleed into the clear water. The aroma of bergamot and lavender drifted upward, grounding me. The tranquility of the room was profound. It was the kind of expensive, insulated silence that only true independence could buy. But that silence was continually, violently punctured by the object sitting on my white marble kitchen island. My phone. It was vibrating so aggressively and consistently that it was physically traveling across the polished stone surface. A relentless, frantic buzzing that rattled against the marble like a trapped insect. I did not reach for it. I did not silence it. I simply stood there, leaning against the counter, holding my warm mug with both hands, and watched the screen light up the darkened kitchen with blinding urgency. 60 missed calls. The number sat there in bright white font, a digital monument to their absolute terror. For a decade, I could not get a single phone call returned from my father. Not when I was hospitalized with exhaustion, not when I spent holidays alone in a cramped studio apartment, and certainly not when I launched my first company. But tonight, I was the most popular woman in Atlanta. The calls were coming in overlapping waves, a desperate rotation between Desmond, Vivica, Sydney, and Preston. When the calls went straight to voicemail, the text messages flooded in, stacking up on my lock screen so fast I could barely read them before the next one pushed it out of view. I took a slow sip of my tea, savoring the warmth, and leaned in closer to read the real-time collapse of their perfect world. The first few texts were from my father. They were exactly what I expected, dripping with the same patriarchal arrogance he had weaponized against me my entire life. Iman, answer your phone immediately. This is not a game. I do not know what kind of stunt you are pulling with Preston's accounts, but you will stop it right now. Call me back. You are ruining my retirement celebration. Then exactly 12 minutes later, the tone shifted. The arrogance cracked. Iman, pick up the phone. Preston's firm just froze his credentials. What did you do? I smiled, taking another sip of tea. The offshore transfer had hit the system. Preston's massive, over-leveraged portfolio, built entirely on the foundation of my anonymous blind trust, was evaporating into thin air. Without my $20 million acting as his collateral, every risky trade, every unauthorized loan, and every bad investment he had made to fund Sydney's lavish lifestyle was being called in by the bank. Then came Sydney's texts. The golden child was losing her shine. Iman, what is going on? Preston is hyperventilating in the country club bathroom. His boss just screamed at him in front of the mayor. Whatever you did, undo it. Preston says he is going to be investigated by the SEC. You are destroying my husband's career. You are so petty and jealous. Pick up your phone right now. Jealous. The word made me laugh aloud in the empty kitchen. Sydney truly believed the universe revolved around her carefully curated social media aesthetic. She had spent the entire evening mocking my clothes and my education, completely unaware that the designer gown she was wearing was effectively paid for by the fractional interest on my intellectual property. Vivica was next, her messages a frantic blend of social panic and attempted matriarchal authority. Iman, the entire gala is whispering about us. Preston just caused a massive scene and knocked over a table. You are embarrassing this family. Call the bank and fix this glitch immediately before the country club board asks us to leave. But the most satisfying messages, the ones that truly captured the beautiful wreckage of the night, were from Preston himself. The 30-year-old wealth manager who had stood in front of Atlanta's elite and told me to go back to my little computer games was unraveling stroke by stroke. Iman, please. Iman, tell me this is a mistake. Tell me you did not pull the funds. SEC compliance just locked me out of my trading terminal. I am ruined, please. I am begging you. I will lose my license. I will go to federal prison. Pick up the phone. I watched his final message glow brightly on the marble counter. I am begging you. I let the words sink in, feeling a profound, absolute sense of closure. They had spent my entire life telling me I was a failure, cutting me down to build themselves up. They had thrown me away because I did not fit their narrow, superficial definition of success. And now the very empire they worshipped was burning to the ground, and I was holding the only bucket of water. I had no intention of putting out the fire. I wanted to watch it burn. I turned away from the vibrating phone, walking toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows to look out over the city. I felt no guilt. I felt no remorse. I felt only the clean, surgical precision of a tumor being permanently removed from my life. The digital paper trail was clean, the offshore accounts were completely secure, and Preston was legally responsible for every single fraudulent maneuver he had executed while trying to play God with my money. The penthouse was perfectly still. I closed my eyes, enjoying the absolute serenity of my success. Then the silence shattered. It was not the soft buzzing of my phone. It was a harsh, blaring alarm that made my eyes snap open. The private security buzzer connected directly to the ground floor lobby of my building began to wail, a continuous, aggressive sound that echoed off the high ceilings. Someone was leaning their entire weight against the call button. Before the concierge could even patch a call through to my intercom to announce the visitors, a heavy, violent pounding erupted against my solid oak front door. They had bypassed the lobby. They had ridden the private elevator up to my floor. The pounding grew louder, frantic, and desperate, vibrating through the walls of my sanctuary. The 60 missed calls were no longer just notifications on a screen. The family that had publicly discarded me 2 hours ago was now standing on my welcome mat. The heavy oak door of my penthouse vibrated against its hinges. The security buzzer was a continuous shrill scream echoing across the vaulted ceilings. I did not rush. I walked slowly across the imported Persian rugs, the soft fabric silencing my footsteps. When I reached the door, I placed my hand on the cold brass handle, took one steadying breath, and pulled it open. 4 faces stared back at me, instantly drained of the self-righteous arrogance they had worn at the country club just 2 hours ago. Desmond, Vivica, Sydney, and Preston stood clustered in my private foyer. Their eyes widened, darting frantically past my shoulder to take in the sheer, undeniable magnitude of my $5 million home. They took in the sweeping spiral staircase, the floor-to-ceiling glass, showcasing the glittering city skyline, the original contemporary artwork hanging on immaculate Venetian plaster walls, and the custom marble fixtures that screamed a level of wealth my father had spent his entire life merely pretending to possess. Vivica actually stumbled back a half step, her manicured hand flying to her throat as she choked on her own disbelief. The shock lasted exactly 3 seconds before pure desperation took over. Preston pushed roughly past my father and stormed into my living room. His designer tuxedo was a wrinkled mess, the bow tie hanging loosely around his neck, his face slick with a terrified, greasy sweat. He was hyperventilating, taking short, ragged breaths as he paced frantically across the floor, his hands pulling at his own hair. "My firm just lost its biggest client," Preston yelled, his voice cracking with high-pitched hysteria. $20 million evaporated into thin air, gone in seconds, and the compliance department traced the IP authorization directly to this address. To you. Tell me you hacked it, Iman. Look me in the eye and tell me you found a backdoor into the Apex Blind Trust and committed federal wire fraud. Tell me you did not just ruin my entire career out of spite. I stepped back and smoothly closed the heavy door, throwing the deadbolt with a solid, echoing click. I leaned against the polished wood, folding my arms across my chest, and watched him spiral. Hack it. I repeated the word slowly, letting it roll off my tongue with absolute precision. Preston, you cannot hack an account that has your own name on the master deed. I own the Apex Trust. I created it 3 years ago when my financial technology company began generating more revenue than your entire boutique firm sees in a decade. You have not been managing an anonymous tech billionaire's portfolio. You have been managing my pocket change. Preston stopped pacing abruptly. He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly, as the devastating reality settled over his narrow shoulders. You were so proud of your recent promotion. I continued, my voice calm and conversational, striking him harder than any scream ever could. You stood in that ballroom tonight boasting about how you handle millions of dollars a day. But the cold, hard truth is, Preston, you have been living off the commission of my company's profits for 3 solid years. That imported car you lease, the lavish trips to the Hamptons you take with Sydney, your exorbitant country club membership fees. All of it was funded by the fraction of a percent I allowed you to scrape off my success. You did not build a legacy. You just carried my bags, and you did a remarkably mediocre job at it. The silence that followed was suffocating. Desmond looked as though he had been physically struck, his rigid patriarchal posture completely collapsing as he processed the fact that his despised cast-off daughter was the phantom whale propping up his golden son-in-law's career. Vivica was clutching Desmond's arm, her eyes darting frantically around the penthouse as if searching for a hidden camera, desperate to believe this was all an elaborate, cruel prank. But it was Sydney who finally broke the quiet. "Liar!" Sydney shrieked, her voice shrill and trembling as she stomped toward me. Her perfectly curled hair was starting to frizz from the humidity and the sheer stress radiating from her body. "You are a pathological liar. You are a college dropout who could not even finish a basic degree at Howard. There is absolutely no way you built a $20 million company. You stole this. You must have found a way to siphon this money from Daddy's retirement accounts. That is why you showed up at the gala tonight. You came to gloat after robbing your own family blind." Sydney stood inches from my face, her chest heaving desperately, clinging to the only narrative she had ever known. The narrative where she was the undisputed, brilliant success story, and I was the miserable, pathetic failure. It was the only worldview that allowed her to sleep at night, and it was currently shattering into a million irreparable pieces on my living room floor. I did not step away from her. I did not raise my voice to match her frantic hysteria. I simply held my ground, letting a cold, lethal smile spread across my face. "You want to talk about stealing?" I asked softly, my eyes locking onto hers with unblinking intensity. "You want to stand in my house and accuse me of taking things that do not belong to me? Let us talk about what I stole, Sydney." The continuous, invisible lens of the room seemed to pan rapidly back and forth, snapping from Sydney's flushed, panicked face to my own predatory calm. She crossed her arms tightly over her ruined silk gown, her chest heaving as she tried to physically shield herself from the sheer magnitude of my authority. The air in the penthouse was thick, heavy with the suffocating realization that they were no longer standing in their own kingdom. They were standing in mine. "You have always been jealous of me," Sydney spat, her voice climbing an octave, desperate to seize control of a narrative that was already dead. "You have hated me since we were teenagers because I am everything you are not. I have the influencer lifestyle. I have the brand deals. I have my degree from Spelman. I put in the work to build a high society life, and you could never handle it. You are just a bitter dropout. You had to hide in the shadows and build some shady internet company because you could not survive in the real world with the rest of us." She lifted her chin, throwing a desperate, pleading look toward Vivica and Desmond for validation. Desmond opened his mouth to agree with his golden child to reinforce the lie they had all lived by, but I did not give him the chance. I did not raise my voice. I simply turned my back on them and walked with deliberate, measured steps toward the kitchen island. I picked up my silver iPad. With a single smooth swipe of my finger, the massive 70-inch smart television mounted on the opposite marble wall flared to life. "You want to talk about putting in the work," I said, my voice cutting through the room like shattered glass. "Let us look at your pristine academic record, Sydney." The screen illuminated the dim room with blinding white light. Displayed in razor-sharp high definition was a highly classified internal document bearing the official crest of Spelman College. Across the top, stamped in aggressive red ink, were 3 words that made the entire room stop breathing: expulsion, academic fraud, plagiarism. Sydney's jaw dropped. The remaining color drained from her face, leaving her looking completely hollow. "Turn that off right now," Desmond commanded, stepping forward, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and sheer panic. "Iman, this is family business. You have no right to display this." "This is my business, Desmond," I replied, locking my eyes with his. "Because of exactly how you chose to pay for it." I swiped the iPad screen again. The television flickered, replacing the disciplinary file with a scanned bank ledger. It was an old account, one that had been closed for exactly 5 years. The name at the top of the statement was my late mother's. Beneath it was a highlighted withdrawal for exactly $100,000. "You did not graduate, Sydney," I said, my voice echoing off the high ceilings as my gaze tracked back to her terrified face. "You paid a graduate student to write your entire final thesis. You got caught, you were brought before the disciplinary board, and you were expelled for gross academic fraud. It was a massive scandal, one that was going to ruin the perfect, flawless family aesthetic Desmond had spent his entire life building." So Desmond panicked. He swooped in to save his golden child from the consequences of her own profound stupidity. I took a step closer to them, the space between us shrinking, the undeniable truth pressing down on their chests. "He paid the university an anonymous donation to keep the expulsion quiet. He paid expensive fixers and lawyers to seal the records so your precious influencer brand would not be tarnished. But he did not use his own money, did he, Sydney? He used the college fund my late biological mother left exclusively for me. He drained my entire tuition to save your skin." Vivica let out a soft gasp, covering her mouth with her hand. She had known, of course she had known, but seeing the undeniable proof projected on a $5 million wall stripped away her ability to deny it. Desmond stared at the floor, absolutely paralyzed by the exposure of his ultimate theft. "I did not drop out because I could not handle the coursework. I continued, my words striking like physical blows. I dropped out because the day my tuition was due, my account was completely empty. I was forced out onto the street, forced to scramble and starve while you got to keep playing dress up and pretending you were an educated socialite. You built your entire fake life on the ashes of my mother's money." Sydney was shaking. She backed away from me, her eyes darting wildly. "Preston, baby!" she stammered, reaching out a trembling hand toward her husband. "Preston, do not listen to her. It does not matter. It is just a piece of paper. She is just trying to tear us apart." But Preston did not reach back. He stood perfectly still, his eyes glued to the bank statements on the television screen. The hyperventilation had stopped, replaced by a terrifying, rigid stillness. The shock of his own destroyed career was suddenly colliding with a brand new catastrophic revelation. He slowly turned his head to look at his wife. The man who had mocked me at the country club was gone, replaced by a cornered, vicious animal, realizing he had been trapped in a cage of his own making. "You do not have a degree?" Preston stated, his voice a low, lethal whisper that made Sydney flinch. "Baby, please." Sydney begged, tears finally spilling over her mascara. "It does not mean anything. We have each other." Preston stepped toward her, his face contorted with a rage so pure it seemed to radiate heat, his hands clenched into tight, white-knuckled fists at his sides. He was entirely indifferent to my presence now. His wrath had completely shifted targets. "You told me you had a trust fund," Preston snarled, his voice rising in volume with every step he took toward her. "When we met, you told me your father had set up an irrevocable trust in your name. You told me you owned the deed to the summer house in Hilton Head. You told me your family was liquid." Desmond stepped between them, raising his hands in a futile attempt to maintain order. "Preston, calm down. Let us handle this privately." "Shut your mouth!" Preston roared violently, slapping Desmond's hands away. He lunged closer to Sydney, his eyes wide and manic. "I married you because you were supposed to be an asset. I leveraged my own firm's capital because you promised me your family had the collateral to back it up. You have nothing. You own nothing. You are nothing but a fraud who stole from her own sister to cover up a cheating scandal." Preston did not stop there. The rapid, frantic movement of his pacing forced the energy in the room to spiral out of control. He was completely unhinged, sweat pouring down his forehead, soaking the collar of his expensive custom shirt. He circled Sydney like a predator, recognizing its prey was already dead. He ripped the silk bow tie from his neck and threw it onto my pristine hardwood floor. "I married you for this portfolio, Sydney?" Preston spat the absolute venom in his voice, stripping away years of carefully practiced country club charm. "I married you because your father paraded you around Buckhead like you were American royalty. You sold me this entire fantasy of the untouchable black elite of Atlanta. You talked about generational wealth, about legacy, about trust funds that would secure our future. I sat through endless dinners listening to Desmond brag about his massive market positions. I bought into the illusion. He stopped pacing and jabbed a trembling finger toward my father, who was suddenly looking incredibly old and fragile standing in my foyer. "He is a terrible investor," Preston yelled, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Desmond's actual trading history is a graveyard of bad bets and outdated strategies. He was bleeding capital for the last 3 years. But I saw the Apex Blind Trust. I saw a continuous, massive influx of clean, untraceable capital sitting right there in his firm's ecosystem. I thought it was his secret safety net. I thought your father was a financial genius playing the long game." Sydney was sobbing loudly now, her hands covering her face, the perfect makeup running down her cheeks in dark, jagged streams. Her fairy tale marriage, the one she flaunted on every social media platform, was being violently dismantled in front of her eyes. Her husband did not view her as a partner. He viewed her as a lucrative acquisition that had just gone spectacularly bankrupt. "So I leveraged my own firm's assets," Preston confessed, his voice cracking as the reality of his impending federal indictment crashed over him again. "I took millions from my partners to cover Desmond's toxic margins because I thought that $20 million account guaranteed everything. I staked my entire professional reputation, my licensing, my freedom on the assumption that this family actually had real money." He turned back to Sydney, his face inches from hers, his eyes wide and manic. "But you people are broke frauds. You lease your cars. You finance your jewelry. You pay your country club dues on credit. You do not have generational wealth. You have a mountain of debt and a closet full of empty designer bags. And now, because of your psychotic sister, I am going to federal prison." The silence that followed his confession was heavier than before. It was the sound of a carefully constructed, multi-generational lie finally collapsing under its own weight. Desmond was physically shaking, his hands shoved deep into his tuxedo pockets, unable to look his son-in-law in the eye. He had been exposed. The Grand Patriarch, the Titan of Atlanta finance, was nothing more than a failed day trader who had been secretly relying on his despised daughter's money to keep the lights on. But Vivica could never let a silence linger if it meant accepting defeat. She stepped forward, pushing past a weeping Sydney and a hyperventilating Preston. Vivica smoothed the front of her sequined gown, lifting her chin with that familiar, imperious arrogance. Even now, standing in a $5 million penthouse, she could never afford completely cornered and exposed. She instinctively reached for her matriarchal authority. She operated under the delusion that if she simply spoke with enough condescension, reality would bend to her will. "That is quite enough." Vivica snapped, her voice sharp and commanding, attempting to instantly sanitize the ugly truth that had just been spilled across my floor. "Preston, compose yourself. You are acting like a hysterical child. We do not air our private financial grievances like this. It is unseemly." She turned her piercing gaze on me. She looked me up and down, her expression a mixture of profound distaste and calculating manipulation. She still viewed me as the rebellious, inadequate teenager she had spent years trying to break. "You have had your little moment, Iman," Vivica said, her tone dripping with toxic maternal authority. "You proved whatever point you felt you needed to make. You threw a tantrum and you disrupted a very important night. But the games end right now. You are going to pick up your phone, call your little offshore bankers, and you are going to wire those funds back into the Apex account immediately." I just stared at her, allowing her delusion to fully materialize in the open air. "Desmond and I have spent decades building our social standing in this city," Vivica continued, taking another step toward me, oblivious to the fact that she possessed absolutely zero leverage. "We sit on charity boards. We are respected members of our church. We have a reputation to uphold. I will not allow your petty jealousy to destroy our lives. You will restore Preston's liquidity, you will fix your father's margins, and you will save this family's good name. Do you understand me, Iman? You will do it right now." The sheer audacity of her demand was breathtaking. She was not asking for a favor. She was issuing a directive fully expecting me to sacrifice my own empire to subsidize the very people who had actively prayed for my downfall. She truly believed that the concept of family loyalty only applied when it required my submission. A slow, cold laugh bubbled up from my chest. It was not a sound of amusement. It was the sound of absolute predatory certainty. I turned away from her commanding glare and took 2 measured steps toward my marble coffee table. Save this family's good name. I repeated, my voice dropping an octave as I reached out and picked up a second thick manila folder that had been sitting there all night. I held it up, feeling the heavy weight of the documents inside. I turned back to Vivica, locking my eyes onto hers with a lethal, unblinking smile. Oh, Vivica, do you really want to talk about saving names? I held the thick manila folder up, letting the ambient light of the penthouse catch the bold red confidential stamp across the front. I watched Vivica closely. The physical transformation was instantaneous and magnificent to witness. It was like watching a slow, creeping push-in on a perfectly painted portrait, as the canvas began to warp and melt away. Her aristocratic posture, the rigid spine that had looked down on me for over 2 decades, suddenly sagged. The blood drained from her meticulously contoured face, leaving a pale, terrified mask. She knew exactly what kind of paper trail she had left behind in Atlanta. She just never believed anyone would be smart enough or motivated enough to follow it. You have spent 20 years cultivating this image of the perfect, pious buckhead matriarch, I said, my voice dropping to a low, deadly register as I untied the string closure of the folder. You hosted the luncheons. You directed the charity galas. You made sure every single member of the country club and the church congregation knew that I was the wayward stepdaughter who just could not fit into your refined, elegant world. I pulled out a thick stack of glossy bank statements and tossed them onto the glass surface of the coffee table. They landed with a heavy, definitive thud. You told everyone I was too ghetto and unrefined to attend your charity galas, Vivica. I continued, taking a step toward her. You laughed when I had to take the bus to work. But you bought that Birkin bag using money meant for the community center's youth program, Vivica gasped, taking a stumbling step backward. Her hands clamped around the designer handbag as if it could physically shield her from the truth. Preston and Sydney both snapped their heads toward her, temporarily distracted from their own imploding marriage by the sheer scale of Vivica's corruption. Preston let out a harsh, barking laugh, running his hands over his face as he realized that every single person in this family was running a different con. Iman, stop this, Vivica whispered, her voice stripped of its usual commanding tone. It sounded reedy and desperate. You are confused. You are misinterpreting church ledgers you do not understand. I manage those funds with absolute integrity. I sit on the steering committee. Integrity. I echoed, pulling out a second stack of papers, these ones stamped with the logos of 3 different high-interest shadow lenders. Is that what you call forging the signatures of the church board members to authorize unapproved withdrawals? You have been siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars from the congregation for the last 4 years. When Desmond's trades started failing and his income dried up, you could not bear the thought of missing a single season in the Hamptons. You could not fathom wearing last year's Chanel to the spring cotillion. I picked up one of the loan documents and shoved it directly into her line of sight. So you started taking out predatory loans to cover the deficit. I stated, my words striking her like physical blows. You used the church's community outreach fund as your own personal piggy bank to pay the exorbitant interest on those shadow loans. You stole money donated to help underprivileged kids buy school supplies so you could maintain your fake socialite status. You are not a matriarch, Vivica. You are a common thief running a Ponzi scheme out of a megachurch. Vivica's eyes darted wildly around the room, landing on Desmond, silently begging him to intervene, to save her the way he had always saved Sydney. But Desmond was staring at the documents on the coffee table, his mouth slightly open, his mind struggling to process the absolute devastation of his household. The golden son-in-law was facing federal prison, the golden daughter was an expelled fraud, and his elegant superior wife was an embezzler. Vivica Desmond croaked, his voice cracking with age and profound disbelief. Tell me she is lying. Tell me you did not touch the church accounts. I am on the deacon board. If they find out money is missing, they will hold me accountable. We will be ruined in this city. We will be humiliated. She did not just touch them, Desmond Y interjected smoothly, refusing to let her formulate another lie. She drained them completely. The community center expansion project that you have been publicly taking credit for all year is bankrupt. The contractors walked off the job site this morning because Vivica's last 3 checks bounced. By tomorrow, the church elders will be filing a police report for grand larceny. Vivica fell to her knees. The dramatic theatrical gesture was completely devoid of its usual power. She was weeping, her hands clawing at the edge of the coffee table. Desmond, I had to. She sobbed, her voice echoing pitifully in the massive penthouse. You were not bringing in any money. The firm was cutting your draw. I had to keep up appearances. If people knew we were struggling, they would have ostracized us. I did it for the family. I did it to protect our standing in the community. You did it for yourself, I said coldly, looking down at the woman who had made my childhood a living nightmare. You built a kingdom on quicksand, and now you get to drown in it. Desmond rubbed his face with trembling hands, looking like a man who had just survived a horrific car crash, only to realize the vehicle was on fire. He shook his head violently, desperately trying to cling to the one piece of leverage he thought he still possessed, the one asset that gave him the illusion of control and wealth. He paced away from his weeping wife, his chest puffing out with a final pathetic surge of patriarchal defiance. This is a nightmare, Desmond muttered, his eyes darting frantically. But we will survive this. We will liquidate. We will sell the estate. The Buckhead house is worth millions. We will sell it, cover the church funds, pay off the shadow loans, and deal with Preston's mess. We are not destitute. He looked at Vivica, trying to force confidence into his voice, trying to assert dominance over a reality that had already slipped through his fingers. What is she talking about? The house is paid off. We have equity. We are completely fine. I slowly closed the manila folder and dropped it onto the glass table. I looked at the man who had ordered security to throw me out of his party just hours before savoring the absolute destruction of his final delusion. Is it Dad? Let's talk about who really owns the roof over your head. I slid a crisp, heavily watermarked document from the very back of the manila folder. I held it up, letting the heavy official parchment catch the ambient light of the penthouse. The room went completely dead silent. You could hear the faint hum of the city traffic 50 stories below, but inside the living room, no one dared to draw a breath. It was as if the air had been entirely sucked out of the space. A sweeping, invisible gravity anchored everyone in place, drawing all their attention directly to me. I stood in the exact center of the room, holding the deed to their entire existence. You see, Desmond, I said, my voice smooth and conversational, deliberately contrasting with the absolute panic radiating from him. While you were completely oblivious, bleeding capital on terrible market trades and pretending to be a financial titan, your wife was desperately trying to plug the massive holes in your sinking ship. Vivica could not handle the idea of downsizing. She could not stomach the thought of telling her country club friends that you were failing. So she took out a second mortgage on the Buckhead estate. Then she took out a third. She leveraged every single square foot of that 10,000 square foot mansion to pay for the illusion of wealth. Desmond slowly turned his head to look down at Vivica, who was still crumpled on the floor by the coffee table. His eyes were wide with a horror that was entirely genuine. You mortgaged the house. Desmond whispered the words, barely escaping his throat. You mortgaged my house behind my back. Vivica could not even look at him. She stared at the imported rug, her shoulders shaking as she wept in total humiliation. By the time she was done, I continued refusing to let them break eye contact with the reality I was projecting. The house was drowning in predatory debt. 3 years ago, the bank initiated aggressive foreclosure proceedings. You were exactly 48 hours away from the sheriff showing up, changing your locks and putting all your custom Italian furniture out on the street for the whole neighborhood to see. But miraculously, an anonymous holding company stepped in at the 11th hour. They bought the debt in its entirety, paid off the bank, and assumed the deed to the property. Preston let out a sudden, sharp bark of laughter. It was a manic, broken sound. He dragged his hands through his sweat-soaked hair, staring at Desmond with pure, unadulterated disgust. "You do not even own your own house," Preston mocked, his voice dripping with venom. "You sat in my office drinking my scotch, giving me investment advice, and you were essentially a squatter. You are a joke." Desmond ignored him. He was staring at the watermarked document in my hand, his mind frantically trying to connect the final devastating dots. He looked at me, his chest rising and falling as the air in the room grew thinner. "You threw me out of that house when I was 20 years old," I said, my voice dropping into a lethal quiet register. I stepped closer to him, lowering my arm, but keeping the deed perfectly visible. "You packed my bags and left them on the front porch because I would not conform to your fake society rules. You told me I was a disgrace because I wanted to build my own technology company instead of marrying whatever compliant trust fund kid you picked out for me. You told me I was cut off. You told me I would never survive in the real world without your money and your prestigious name." Sydney let out a soft, whimpering sound, backing away from her father, as the true scale of my revenge finally materialized in her mind. "Now," I asked, softly tilting my head, "I own the very floorboards you walk on. I own the marble columns you boast about to your friends. I own the formal dining room where you sit every Thanksgiving and tell everyone what a miserable failure I am. I am the sole owner and majority shareholder of that anonymous holding company. I saved you from the street, Desmond. I have been your landlord for 3 solid years. You sleep every single night under a roof that I pay for." The silence returned, heavier and more suffocating than before. The absolute destruction of the Addams family was complete. Their wealth, their status, their academic achievements, and their physical home had all been systematically dismantled and laid bare on my living room floor. Vivica was a criminal. Sydney was an expelled fraud. Preston was facing federal prison. And Desmond, the great patriarch, was a broke tenant living on the charity of the daughter he had discarded. But as I watched Desmond process his total defeat, something shifted. The shock and horror began to recede from his face, replaced rapidly by a deep, ugly shade of crimson. His entire identity as an alpha male provider had just been incinerated, but his toxic pride refused to let him submit. He would not allow himself to be broken by a woman, especially not his own daughter. Desmond drew himself up to his full height. He took a deep, ragged breath, puffing out his chest as he desperately tried to reclaim his shattered patriarchal dominance. He smoothed the lapels of his wrinkled tuxedo jacket, his jaw setting into a hard, rigid line. He looked at me not with surrender, but with a sudden, chilling malice. "You think you have won?" he growled, his voice dropping into a dark, menacing register that commanded the attention of everyone in the room. "You think because you bought a piece of paper and humiliated your mother, that you can stand in front of me and act like you are the master of this family?" He took a slow, deliberate step toward me, his eyes narrowing into cold slits. "You forget who taught you how to play this game, Iman," Desmond said, a cruel, arrogant smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. "You think you are the only one who knows how to dig up dirt. You forget that I never walk into a room without an insurance policy." Desmond reached his hand into the inner breast pocket of his tuxedo jacket. He did not pull out a bank statement or a legal document. He pulled out a small, encrypted black flash drive, holding it up tightly between his thumb and forefinger so the metal caught the light. "That flash drive holds every digital footprint of your early algorithms," Desmond sneered, slipping the small metal rectangle back into his pocket before his hand emerged again, this time gripping a folded, yellowed piece of paper. He stepped directly into my personal space, his chest expanding as he tried to physically intimidate me. The imaginary camera of the room seemed to drop to a low angle, looking up at Desmond as he tried to tower over me, desperate to cast a long, terrifying shadow. He wanted to be the giant again. He wanted to be the absolute patriarch who dictated the terms of my survival. He snapped his wrist, shaking the aged paper open, with a loud, aggressive crack that made Vivica flinch. "You think you are the only one who keeps receipts, Iman?" he asked, his voice dripping with a sickening paternal malice. "You think you can outsmart the man who taught you how to read a ledger?" Let us take a little walk down memory lane. Let us go back to when you were 19 years old, sitting in my home office practically begging me for a $5,000 loan so you could lease your first dedicated server space. Vivica slowly stopped her weeping. She wiped her tear-streaked face, her eyes locking onto the paper as if it were a life raft floating in the middle of a hurricane. Preston stopped his frantic, manic pacing. His chest heaved as he waited to see if his ruined father-in-law actually possessed the leverage to save them all from a federal indictment. "I told you." "No." Desmond continued, a triumphant, ugly smile stretching across his face. "I told you your tech project was a waste of time, and that you needed to focus on finding a suitable husband. But you would not let it go. You were desperate. You were starving. So I offered you a compromise. I told you I would not give you my money, but I would co-sign a commercial loan for you. I put my prestigious name on the line so the bank would release the $5,000 to a broke, arrogant teenager." He leaned in closer, the scent of his expensive cologne mixing with the sour stench of his nervous sweat. "But you were so eager to get your hands on that cash," Desmond whispered, relishing every single syllable. "You were so desperate to prove you could build an empire without my direct charity that you rushed the paperwork." Desmond shoved the age contract directly toward my face. The ink was faded, but the dense legal jargon was unmistakable. "Read the fine print, you ungrateful brat," Desmond commanded, his voice rising into a booming, authoritative roar. "I co-signed your first business loan. Legally, I own 30% of any intellectual property you built from it. That $20 million, $6 million, belongs to me." He let the math hang heavily in the air, watching my eyes for a flicker of panic that simply did not exist. "You stood there and bragged about your blind trust." Desmond sneered, practically vibrating with toxic excitement. "You gloated about holding the deed to my house. But under the law, Iman, you owe me. 30% of your entire net worth belongs directly to me. I own your code. I own your algorithms. I own your company. $6 million of pure liquid capital is legally mine." He expected me to shatter. He expected the calm, predatory composure to crack, giving way to the terrified, inadequate 19-year-old girl he remembered. He waited for the hyperventilation, the begging, the desperate negotiation. I did not blink. I did not flinch. I did not even step back to give him the satisfaction of yielding a single inch of my own territory. The perspective of the room drastically shifted, the invisible lens rising high above us, looking down at Desmond. From this angle, he was not a titan. He was just a pathetic, aging man, clutching a piece of garbage standing in the foyer of a penthouse he could never afford, begging for a bailout from the daughter he had thrown away. I held my ground effortlessly, letting his hollow threats wash over me like a light breeze. "You are going to transfer those funds to my account by tomorrow morning," Desmond ordered, though his voice lacked the absolute iron certainty it possessed a moment ago. My silence was deeply unnerving him. "If you do not, I will take this contract straight to a judge. I will file an injunction. I will freeze every single asset tied to your holding company. I will drag your pristine tech firm into a vicious public legal battle that will terrify your investors and crash your valuation overnight. You will lose everything, Iman. I will dismantle you." "You have a choice," Vivica chimed in, her voice trembling, but suddenly hopeful, emboldened by her husband's ruthless extortion attempt. "Pay us what you owe your father, and we can put all this ugliness behind us. We can save the estate. We can save Preston. We can be a family again." The sheer, unadulterated delusion in her voice was staggering. They were standing in the burning wreckage of their own lies, surrounded by the undeniable proof of their embezzlement, fraud, and theft, yet they still believed they were the ones dictating the terms of my surrender. I looked at the yellowed contract shaking in Desmond's hand. I looked at the sweat pooling at his temples. I looked at the desperate, hungry gleam in his eyes. He needed that $6 million to survive the week. He needed it to keep the bank from seizing his home, to keep the church elders from pressing charges against his wife, and to keep the federal investigators away from his son-in-law. He was betting his entire existence, his entire legacy, on a single piece of paper. I tilted my head, letting a slow, lethal smile spread across my face. Before I could even open my mouth to completely eviscerate his final pathetic house of cards, a soft, pristine sound cut through the heavy, suffocating tension of the room. Ding! It was the polished metallic chime of my private penthouse elevator. Desmond froze the contract, hovering uselessly in the air. Vivica spun around, her eyes wide with fresh panic. Preston backed away from Sydney, staring at the polished steel doors at the end of the grand foyer. No one was supposed to have access to this floor. Security was strictly instructed to clear all visitors through my personal control panel. The heavy metallic doors slid open with a smooth, silent hum. Actually, Desmond. A sharp, authoritative voice rang out, cutting through the patriarch's delusion like a blade. The statute of limitations on that voided contract expired 5 years ago. The polished steel doors of the private elevator glided apart with a quiet, expensive hum, and Sterling stepped onto the penthouse hardwood. A slick tracking shot would have perfectly captured his entrance, following his measured, predatory stride as he crossed the threshold. His tailored charcoal suit was completely immaculate, catching the ambient light of the room, and his leather briefcase was gripped securely in his right hand. As he advanced into the center of the living room, the perspective shifted, pivoting to reveal the immediate visceral reaction of the room's occupants. The Addams family instinctively shrank back. Desmond's artificially inflated chest hollowed out instantly. Vivica scrambled backward on her knees, putting physical distance between herself and the newcomer. Sydney shrank against the far wall, crossing her arms protectively over her chest, as if she could hide from the consequences of her own life. Sterling did not just enter the room, he annexed it. He stopped shoulder to shoulder with me, radiating the kind of absolute legal authority that costs thousands of dollars an hour. Without rushing, he placed his briefcase onto the glass coffee table directly over Vivica's scattered incriminating bank statements. He snapped the golden latches open. The sharp metallic click echoed like a gunshot through the silent penthouse. "Who the hell are you?" Desmond demanded, though his voice wavered violently, stripping away any remaining illusion of dominance. "How did you get past security?" "I am the man who makes sure parasites like you never extract a single dime from my client," Sterling replied smoothly, withdrawing a pristine, thick folder from his briefcase. He did not look at Desmond with anger. He looked at him with profound clinical boredom. "That piece of trash you are waving around is a voided contract for a defunct limited liability company that ceased to exist half a decade ago." Desmond gripped the yellowed paper tighter, his knuckles turning white as he shook it in the air. "I co-signed the loan. I own 30% of her intellectual property. The law is the law, and I will see her in court." Sterling actually smiled. It was a terrifying, humorless expression. "You do not own anything, Desmond. Let me give you a free legal consultation since you clearly cannot afford your own representation anymore. The LLC you are referring to went bankrupt exactly 5 years and 2 months ago. Iman dissolved the entity legally, properly, and completely. And do you know exactly why she had to dissolve it?" Sterling took a step forward, his eyes locking onto Desmond with laser precision, dismantling the older man piece by piece. "Because you cut off her health insurance when she was hospitalized with severe exhaustion." Desmond Sterling stated, his voice ringing with absolute clarity. "You found out she was working 80-hour weeks to keep her servers running, and when her body finally gave out, you called the insurance provider and vindictively removed her as a dependent. You intentionally tried to bankrupt her with medical debt to force her to come crawling back to your house and submit to your control. She had to liquidate her first company just to pay the massive hospital bills you essentially handed her. You killed the very asset you are now trying to claim ownership over." Desmond's mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked at the yellowed paper in his hand as if it had suddenly become radioactive. Sterling pulled a crisp stack of documents from his folder and dropped them onto the glass table, fanning them out so the fresh corporate seals were clearly visible to everyone in the room. When Iman recovered, she started over from scratch. Sterling continued delivering each sentence like a physical blow. She formed a brand new C-Corp entirely independently. She funded the new venture with a state technology grant for female entrepreneurs, not your toxic predatory loan. The algorithms, the code, the intellectual property that generated $20 million in valuation were all developed under the new corporate structure. You have absolutely zero equity, zero leverage, and zero legal standing. If you try to file an injunction with that outdated garbage in your hand, I will personally see you sanctioned for malicious litigation, and then I will sue you for legal fees. You will spend the rest of your life failing to pay. The yellowed contract slipped from Desmond's trembling fingers, fluttering aimlessly to the floor. The great patriarch of the Addams family looked entirely hollowed out, a broken shell of a man, realizing his final desperate gambit had been annihilated with surgical precision. He stumbled backward, his knees giving out as he bumped into an armchair and collapsed into it. He buried his face in his trembling hands, entirely defeated. Vivica continued to sob silently on the floor, the realization of their total destitution finally cementing itself in her mind. They had nothing. No house, no leverage, no escape route. While Desmond and Vivica drowned in their absolute defeat, I watched Preston. The golden son-in-law had been standing frozen near the bar, his eyes darting around the room as he calculated the rapidly shifting dynamics of his survival. He looked at Desmond, a man broken and legally obliterated. He looked at Vivica, a confirmed embezzler just waiting for a police escort. He looked at his wife Sydney, who was staring blankly at the wall, completely useless in a crisis. Preston was a survivor. He was a rat who knew exactly when a ship was fully submerged, and he had no intention of drowning with the Addams family. His eyes shifted to me, dark and frantically calculating. He smoothed his expensive tie, took a deep breath, and physically stepped away from the wreckage of his wife's family. He walked slowly toward me, holding his hands up, slightly adopting the smooth, placating tone of a man desperately trying to negotiate his way out of a hostage situation. Iman Preston said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur as he stopped a few feet away. Let us be entirely reasonable here. Desmond and Vivica dug their own graves. I have absolutely nothing to do with their financial crimes or their real estate fraud. They deserve everything that is coming to them. Sydney snapped her head toward her husband, her tear-streaked face twisting in absolute shock. Preston, what are you doing? Preston did not even spare his wife a single glance. He kept his eyes locked intensely on mine, his self-preservation overriding any marital loyalty. But you and I, we are business people, Preston continued, stepping slightly closer, lowering his voice, so only Sterling and I could hear clearly. We understand leverage. You have the files from my office. You know about the offshore accounts? You know the federal investigators are building a massive case. I stared at him, my expression a completely unreadable mask. I am listening, Preston. Preston licked his lips, the scent of his own desperation thick in the air. I can give you everything you need to completely dismantle my senior partners. I have hidden hard drives. I have encrypted emails. I can give you the exact ledgers that prove the insider trading network extends all the way to the state senator's office. I will hand over the keys to the entire kingdom. He gestured dismissively over his shoulder toward his weeping wife, treating her like discarded garbage. I will divorce Sydney tomorrow morning. Preston offered ruthlessly, sealing his betrayal without a single second of hesitation. I will sign whatever non-disclosure agreements your attorney drafts right now. I will walk away from this family completely and give you the ultimate leverage to destroy my firm. All I ask in return is that you leave my name out of the files you hand over to the feds. Spare me, Iman. Spare me, and I will give you the heads of everyone else on a silver platter. The absolute silence that followed Preston's treacherous offer lasted only a fraction of a second before Sydney completely snapped. The visual perspective of the room fractured into fast, jerky, chaotic movements, mirroring the sudden and violent implosion of her perfect manufactured reality. Sydney let out a raw, guttural shriek that tore through the penthouse. It was not the delicate, refined cry of a buckhead socialite. It was the primal, hysterical scream of a woman watching her entire life, her marriage and her safety net evaporate in real time. She launched herself across the grand foyer. She slammed into Preston with the force of a derailed train, her manicured hands curling into claws. She slapped his chest, tore at the lapels of his custom suit, and pummeled his shoulders with a frantic, uncoordinated rage. How could you? Sydney shrieked, her voice cracking as she rained blows down on him. "We are married. We are supposed to be a team. You are trading me to save yourself. You coward. You absolute coward." Preston staggered backward under the sudden weight of her assault, his arms coming up to shield his face. The polished veneer he had maintained for years vanished entirely, replaced by the cornered, vicious panic of a trapped animal. He did not try to soothe her. He did not try to explain. He reached out his hands, closing violently around her wrists. He twisted her arms downward and shoved her away with a sudden, brutal force. Sydney stumbled backward, her designer heels catching on the edge of the imported rug. She fell hard, collapsing onto the hardwood floor mere feet away from where her mother was still weeping. "Do not touch me!" Preston roared, his face flushed an ugly mottled red. His chest heaved as he pointed a trembling finger down at his wife. "You do not get to play the victim here, Sydney. You and your fraudulent, pathetic family ruined my life. I tied myself to this sinking ship because your father convinced me he was a titan. He promised me connections. He promised me capital. Instead, I got a hollowed-out fraud who did not even own the roof over his head." Preston paced frantically, his hands pulling at his own hair as he unleashed years of suppressed venom. "Do you have any idea how much money it took to keep you happy, Sydney?" he demanded, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Do you know what it cost to maintain your country club memberships, your European vacations, and your weekly shopping sprees while your father secretly spiraled into bankruptcy? I was drowning. I was drowning in your expectations. I only made those trades because I had to cover the massive deficit your lifestyle created. You made me a criminal." Sydney lay on the floor, staring up at the man she had sworn to love and cherish. Her mouth opened, but the betrayal was so absolute, so fundamentally shattering, that she could not formulate a single word. She just gasped for air, looking like a fish thrown onto dry land. I stood motionless beside Sterling, watching the chaotic, miserable destruction of their golden marriage. I felt absolutely zero pity. I felt only a cold, clinical disgust. Preston was a weak, spineless opportunist who was perfectly happy to ride the wave of their imaginary wealth and equally eager to throw them all overboard the second the ship began taking on water. He turned back to me, ignoring his wife completely. His eyes were wide and desperate. He dropped heavily onto his knees, the expensive fabric of his trousers pooling around him on the floor. He clasped his hands together, looking up at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. "Please," Iman Preston begged, his voice cracking. "I can give you the offshore routing numbers. I can give you the encrypted servers where the senior partners hide the client funds. I will testify against all of them. I will be your star witness. Just let me walk away from this." I looked down at him, letting the heavy, suffocating silence stretch out for a long, agonizing moment. I savored the absolute reversal of power. "You used to sit at our Thanksgiving table, Preston," I said, my voice ringing with a calm, lethal clarity that made him flinch. "You used to drink Desmond's expensive scotch, look me right in the eye, and mock my natural hair. You used to pull Sydney aside and whisper that I simply was not corporate material. You laughed when I had to wear the same discount suit to 3 different investor pitches. You told everyone in your firm that I lacked the pedigree to ever step foot in a real boardroom, and that my tech company was a cute little hobby that would inevitably fail." I took a slow, deliberate step toward him. He shrank back slightly, his hands still clasped together in supplication. "Now look at you," I stated coldly. "You are begging on your knees to the black woman you spent 5 years humiliating. You are groveling on the floor of my penthouse, offering to sell out your own wife just to save your own pathetic skin." Sterling stepped forward, opening his leather briefcase once more. He did not pull out a contract. He pulled out a single printed confirmation page containing an official government seal. He handed it to me smoothly. "You are offering me leverage that I do not need, Preston," I said, looking down at the shaking, terrified man. "I already have the hidden ledgers. I already have the routing numbers. My security team breached your firm's encrypted servers 3 weeks ago. I know exactly how much client capital you leveraged without authorization, and I know exactly where you hid the returns." Preston's face drained of all remaining color. His mouth fell open. You hacked the firm. I did not have to hack anything, I corrected him smoothly. You used the same password for your offshore accounts that you used for your home Wi-Fi. You were so arrogant, so convinced of your own superior intelligence that you left the front door wide open. I held up the printed confirmation page and let it drop. It fluttered through the air, landing gently on the floor right between Preston's knees. I already sent an anonymous tip, along with all the decrypted ledgers, directly to the Enforcement Division of the Securities and Exchange Commission, I said, my voice completely devoid of mercy. The package was securely transmitted, and receipt was confirmed exactly 45 minutes ago. You have nothing left to trade, Preston. You are entirely out of time. The sheer finality of my words struck him like a physical blow. He stared at the confirmation page on the floor, his entire body trembling as the inescapable reality of federal prison closed in around him. Suddenly, a sharp, piercing electronic marimba sound shattered the silence. Preston jumped, letting out a startled gasp. It was his phone ringing loudly from the inside pocket of his suit jacket. He scrambled frantically to pull it out, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped the device on the hardwood. He stared at the glowing screen. His eyes widened to impossible proportions. The caller ID flashed brightly in the dim light of the room. It was his senior managing partner. The marimba tone echoed in the cavernous penthouse, a cheerful, upbeat sound that stood in horrifying contrast to the destruction unfolding in the room. Preston did not answer it. He stared at the name of his senior managing partner, as if the digital letters were written in acid. The phone slipped from his trembling, sweaty fingers, clattering loudly against the polished hardwood. He did not bother to pick it up. He did not look at Desmond, the man who had dragged him into this mess. He did not look at Vivica. And he certainly did not spare a final glance for his wife. Preston simply turned on his heel and bolted. He practically scrambled toward the private elevator, his expensive leather shoes slipping frantically on the floor, desperately trying to escape the blast radius of his own imploding life. The lens of our reality narrowed, pushing into a tight, suffocating close-up on Sydney's face. Her meticulously contoured makeup, a flawless mask that had taken hours and thousands of dollars to perfect, was actively melting under the heat of her absolute panic. Dark, heavy streaks of expensive mascara ran down her pale, blotchy cheeks. The camera slowly began to back away visually, severing her from the warmth, power, and luxury of the room, emphasizing her profound and utter isolation. For 28 years, she had been the undisputed golden child of the Addams dynasty. She was the one who did everything perfectly right, the one who married the rising star, attended the exclusive galas, and curated the flawless, enviable existence that made other women sick with jealousy. Now the absolute totality of her ruin crashed down on her shoulders, heavy and inescapable. She had no college degree because the university was going to publicly expel her for paying a proxy to take her final exams. She had no trust fund because her father had squandered every last dime on terrible investments and predatory interest rates. She had a husband who was currently sprinting out of the building toward a guaranteed federal indictment. And she was kneeling on the floor of a penthouse owned by the stepsister she had spent a lifetime treating like absolute garbage. Sydney looked up at me, her chest heaving with panicked, shallow breaths. The haughty, aristocratic sneer she had always worn like a diamond crown was completely gone, shattered into a million irreparable pieces. In its place was a pathetic, groveling desperation that made her look small and remarkably ordinary. Iman, she choked out, her voice a high, reedy whine that scraped against the silence of the room. Iman, please. You cannot just leave me with nothing. You cannot do this to me. I have brand deals. I have corporate sponsorships. I have a lifestyle brand that completely depends on my image. If I lose the Buckhead house, if the media finds out Preston is going to prison, I will lose all my followers. My entire network will drop me. I will be completely ruined in this city. She crawled a few inches forward on the expensive rug, her hands reaching out but stopping just short of touching my shoes, as if she knew she lacked the right to even make physical contact. Just give me a loan. Sydney begged, the words tumbling out of her mouth in a pathetic, hyperventilating rush. You have $20 million. You have more money than you could ever possibly spend in a lifetime. Just give me enough to keep my luxury apartment in the city, just enough to keep up appearances to hire a crisis PR team until I can rebrand and distance myself from Preston. You are my sister. We grew up together. You have to help me." I looked down at the weeping, shattered woman at my feet. My expression remained entirely impassive, a fortress of cold stone. I did not feel a single ounce of familial obligation. I did not feel the slightest twinge of sympathy. I only felt the cold, hard weight of a 20-year-old score finally being settled. "You watched Mom and Dad throw me out in the freezing rain when I was 19 years old," I said, my voice cutting through her frantic sobs with absolute chilling precision. "You stood on the wrap-around porch of that massive estate, holding a glass of champagne, and you laughed. You actually laughed, Sydney, as I dragged 2 black garbage bags containing my entire life down the driveway." Sydney flinched violently, closing her eyes as the memory struck her, trying to shrink away from the undeniable truth of her own cruelty. "When your country club friends asked where I went, you did not just say we lost touch." I continued, my words striking her like physical blows, deliberate and measured. "You told your followers I was a distant cousin with a drug problem so I would not ruin your flawless upper-crust aesthetic. You built your entire online persona by stepping on my throat. You used my forced absence to gather sympathy and likes. So, no, Sydney. You are not getting a single dime of my money. Go ask your followers to pay your rent." Sydney collapsed completely, curling into a tight, weeping ball on the floor, her manicured hands covering her face to hide her total devastation. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the sound of her muffled, pathetic sobs. The Addams family was entirely broken, their wealth and status eradicated, their pride ground into fine dust. But the family was not entirely out of ammunition. Vivica, who had been uncharacteristically silent since Sterling systematically dismantled her husband's legal threats, slowly pushed herself up from the floor. Her makeup was ruined, her designer dress wrinkled and stained with her own tears, but her eyes held a sudden, venomous glint. The desperation of a cornered animal had given way to a dark, vicious malice. She smoothed the front of her skirt, a twisted, desperate smile forming on her pale lips. "You think you are so morally superior," Iman Vivica hissed, her voice dripping with pure, concentrated poison. "You think you hold all the cards because you have money and a clever lawyer. You think you know everything about this family. But you do not know the real reason your biological mother died, do you?" The incessant, cheerful ringing of Preston's phone hung in the air like a death knell. He simply stared down at the glowing screen, his entire body trembling violently, completely paralyzed by the realization that his fraudulent empire had officially collapsed. But Vivica ignored him. She ignored her weeping daughter on the floor. She ignored her broken husband slumped in the armchair. Her eyes were fixed entirely on me, burning with a toxic, desperate hatred. The invisible Steadicam of the room seemed to smoothly dolly in, pushing past the wreckage of the Addams family to focus solely on Vivica as she closed the distance between us. She moved with the rigid, jerky motion of a predator, making one final suicidal leap. She stopped just inches from my face. She dropped her voice into a venomous, conspiratorial whisper, intending to strip away my armor, with the one thing she thought I still held sacred. "You think you are untouchable because you built a little technology company?" Vivica hissed, her breath hot and sour. "You think you can walk into my home and destroy my family without consequences? But I know your weak spot, Iman. I have always known it. Desmond never told you the truth about your precious biological mother, did he?" I did not break eye contact. I did not shift my weight. I let her speak, watching her dig her own grave with absolute fascination. "He told you she died of heart failure," Vivica continued, a cruel, triumphant smile twisting her features. "He told you she was a good, hard-working woman who just got sick." That was a lie, Iman. A convenient lie. Desmond spun to protect his own rising reputation at the firm. "Your mother was a junkie. She was a pathetic chronic addict who overdosed in a filthy motel room on the south side of Atlanta. And I have the fabricated police reports and the doctored medical records to prove it." The sheer, unadulterated evil of her words was staggering. She was standing in the middle of her own ruined life, facing federal indictments and total bankruptcy, and her instinct was to weaponize the memory of a dead woman. Vivica leaned in even closer, her voice dripping with pious, judgmental malice. I know your fintech firm is preparing to go public next quarter. I know you are courting major institutional investors who demand absolute perfection from their minority founders. What do you think is going to happen to your pristine billion-dollar valuation when I take these records straight to the press? She was hyperventilating now, high on the fumes of her own perceived leverage. I sit on the board of every major philanthropic committee in this city. Vivica threatened, her eyes wide and manic. I have the ear of the senior pastors at the largest megachurches in the state. I know the presidents of every exclusive social club. If you do not wire $10 million into an offshore account by tomorrow morning, I will release this story to every media outlet in the country. I will paint you as the unstable, deceptive offspring of a drug addict. I will ruin your corporate reputation so thoroughly that Wall Street will not touch your initial public offering with a 10-foot pole. I will make sure every Black elite organization in the South blacklists you for the rest of your natural life. She stood back, her chest heaving, waiting for the impact. She waited for me to crumble. She wanted tears. She wanted me to beg her to spare my mother's memory. She wanted the terrified, insecure 19-year-old girl to resurface and surrender to the matriarch of the Addams family. I looked at Vivica. I looked at the smeared, expensive foundation on her face, the way her designer silk dress clung to her sweating, trembling frame. She was not a powerful socialite. She was a desperate, malicious fraud attempting to extort me with a ghost. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of anger. I just tilted my head, studying her with cold, clinical detachment. You are threatening to blackmail me with forged documents about my dead mother to save a lifestyle you funded through theft, I stated, laying out the absolute absurdity of her plan. You are standing in a penthouse you do not own, wearing clothes paid for by stolen client funds, threatening the CEO of a multi-million-dollar company with fake gossip. Vivica's eyes darted nervously, her triumphant smile faltering slightly as my complete lack of panic registered. It is not gossip if the press prints it, she spat back, clinging desperately to her sinking ship. You will pay me, Iman. You will pay me to protect her memory. I did not respond to her. Instead, I simply turned my head and gave Sterling a single slight nod. Sterling did not say a word. He reached into his immaculate leather briefcase with practiced, terrifying efficiency. He did not pull out a legal brief or a cease and desist order. He withdrew a thick, unmarked manila envelope. He stepped around me, closing the distance between himself and Vivica. He held the envelope out, offering it to her with a look of absolute chilling indifference. Vivica stared at the envelope as if it were a loaded weapon. Her hands shook as she slowly reached out and took it. She clutched it against her chest, her eyes darting frantically between Sterling and me. Go ahead, Vivica, I said, my voice dropping to a smooth, lethal calm that froze the air in the room. Go to the press. Go to your precious church elders. Go to the country club board and the social committees. Tell them whatever fabricated lies you want about my mother. But you might want to review these photos first. The invisible lens of the room executed a fast, brutal tilt down, focusing sharply on the thick manila envelope in Vivica's trembling hands before executing a lightning-fast snap up to capture the sheer, unadulterated horror flooding her widened eyes. She pulled the flap back, her manicured fingers sliding into the envelope to extract the contents. She expected a legal threat. She expected a countersuit. She did not expect the glossy, high-resolution 8x10 photographs that spilled out, scattering across her lap and onto the polished hardwood floor. The first photograph was crystal clear, capturing Vivica in a highly compromising, intimately tangled position with the head contractor she had hired to renovate the Buckhead Estates pool house. The timestamp in the corner was dated barely 4 months ago. The second photo featured her locked in a passionate embrace with the much younger lead landscape architect in the back seat of his truck. The third, fourth, and fifth photos were variations of the same devastating theme, documenting a serial, reckless string of infidelities that completely vaporized her carefully curated image of the pious, devoted matriarch. But the envelope did not just hold evidence of her moral bankruptcy. Sliding out beneath the scandalous photographs was a thick stack of bank statements highlighted with bright yellow marker. They were undeniable hard copies of wire transfers moving massive sums of money from the elite church's community outreach charity fund directly into Vivica's private offshore shell accounts. Vivica stopped breathing. Her chest froze. The venomous blackmailing predator from 5 seconds ago vanished, instantly replaced by a woman staring directly down the barrel of a loaded gun. "You called me an embarrassment to the family name?" I stated coldly, my voice slicing through the dead silence of the penthouse like a scalpel. "You told your country club friends I was a stain on your pristine legacy. You stood in church every Sunday and preached about morality while looking down your nose at me. But you two are facing 15 years in federal prison for tax fraud and embezzlement. I did not have to dig for this. Your own sloppy accountants left a digital paper trail a mile wide." Desmond, who had been sitting paralyzed in the armchair, slowly lifted his head. The mention of federal prison pierced through his shock. He dragged himself to his feet, his joints popping, and stumbled heavily toward his wife. Vivica scrambled desperately to gather the glossy photos, trying to shove them back into the envelope, her hands shaking so violently she kept dropping them. "No, Desmond, do not look at these," she gasped, her voice shrill and panicked. "It is fake. Iman manufactured these to tear us apart." But she was not fast enough. Desmond snatched a handful of the documents from her frantic grip. His bloodshot eyes scanned the top page. It was a copy of the church's tax returns. He knew those numbers. He recognized his own forged signatures, the doctored deductions he had personally overseen to help Vivica cover up the missing charity funds. He had committed a federal offense to help his wife balance the books, believing they were unified in their desperate attempt to save their lavish lifestyle. Then the financial statement slipped from his grasp, revealing the glossy photograph trapped beneath it. Desmond froze. The paper in his hands began to violently shake. He stared at the high-definition image of his wife and the pool contractor. He dropped it and grabbed another one, revealing the landscape architect. He snatched a third photo, then a fourth. The color completely drained from his face, replaced by an ugly, mottled purple. I watched the exact moment the great imposing patriarch of the Addams family finally shattered into a million irreparable pieces. "You told me you were at evening charity board meetings." Desmond whispered, his voice a low, dangerous rasp that vibrated with decades of suppressed rage. "You told me you were raising funds for the youth annex." "Desmond, please," Vivica cried out, reaching for his pant leg. "I can explain. It meant absolutely nothing. I was stressed. You were always working, always failing to bring in enough money to keep the estate afloat. I needed an outlet." "You needed an outlet!" Desmond roared, the sound tearing from his throat like a wounded beast. His entire body shook with an explosive, uncontrollable fury. "I committed tax fraud for you. I doctored the church ledgers because you came to me crying, saying you accidentally overspent the charity budget on the gala. I tied my name to a federal crime to keep you out of a prison cell, and you were sleeping with the men I paid to mow my lawn." He ripped the photographs in half, throwing the pieces directly into her tear-streaked face. "You absolute parasite!" Desmond screamed, spit flying from his lips as he loomed over her. "I lost my firm. I lost my house. I am going to be indicted by the federal government because I tried to protect a woman who was making me a laughingstock behind my back. You dragged me into a 15-year prison sentence while you were entertaining contractors in my pool house." Vivica's pathetic weeping instantly morphed into vicious defensive rage. She scrambled to her feet, her expensive dress twisting around her legs. She did not cower. She lashed out. "Do not you dare play the righteous victim with me, Desmond," she shrieked, pointing a manicured finger directly at his face. "I stepped out because you stopped being a man 10 years ago. You were a failure. You could not maintain the cash flow. You could not keep up with the investors. I had to smile and play the perfect wealthy wife while you secretly took out third mortgages just to keep the lights on. I embezzled that money because you failed to provide the life you promised me. You forced me to steal." Desmond lunged forward, grabbing her by the shoulders of her designer dress and shaking her violently. "You arrogant, ungrateful fraud! I gave you everything. I built this family. You destroyed this family, Vivica screamed back, slapping at his chest, her nails digging into his suit jacket. You ruined us with your terrible investments and your massive, fragile ego. You are nothing but a broke, pathetic old man. The perfect, untouchable marriage of the Addams dynasty violently imploded right in the center of my living room. They screamed at each other, their voices echoing off the floor to ceiling windows, tearing away decades of carefully constructed lies, fake smiles, and manufactured superiority. They cursed each other's existence, each desperately trying to shift the blame for their total, inescapable ruin onto the other. I stood beside Sterling, my hands resting calmly in the pockets of my trousers. I did not interject. I did not ask them to leave. I simply stood in absolute silence, watching the two people who had made it their life's mission to destroy my self-worth completely annihilate each other. The screaming match between Desmond and Vivica finally burned itself out, leaving nothing but the ragged sound of their heavy breathing echoing against the floor-to-ceiling glass. Vivica sank onto the expensive sofa, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking as the reality of her exposure set in. Desmond remained standing in the center of the foyer, completely motionless. The invisible camera of the room detached itself from the wider scene and began a slow, merciless, unbroken circle around Desmond. It captured every angle of his absolute ruin. It captured the sweat pooling on his forehead, the frantic pulse beating at his temple, the way his expensive tailored suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too big for a man who was rapidly shrinking into nothingness. From the front, he looked like a defeated patriarch. From the side, a cornered criminal. From the back, an old, tired man who had just realized he possessed absolutely nothing. He had no money, he had no real estate, he had no loyal wife, he had no prestigious legacy, he had no freedom. He looked at the torn photographs scattered on the floor, the visual proof of his wife's blatant infidelity and his own criminal complicity. He looked at the empty elevator shaft where Preston had cowardly fled. Then slowly, painfully, his bloodshot eyes tracked upward and locked onto me. I stood perfectly still, watching the gears turn in his desperate mind. I could see the exact moment he realized anger and threats would no longer work. His legal extortion had failed. Vivica's blackmail had exploded in her face. The only card he had left to play was the one he had spent my entire life violating. Desmond straightened his posture, pulling his shoulders back in a pathetic attempt to summon the ghosts of his former authority. He smoothed his lapels with shaking hands. He cleared his throat, pushing the raw, screaming fury down and attempting to replace it with the grave, solemn baritone of a devoted father. Desmond began, his voice taking on a heavy theatrical resonance. We have said things today in the heat of anger. Ugly things. Unfortunate things. But when you strip away the money and the business and the mistakes, we are still bound by something sacred. We are bound by blood. He took a slow step toward me, holding his hands out with his palms facing upward in a gesture of fake surrender. Blood is thicker than water. Iman, he continued, leaning heavily into his practiced religious cadence. You are my flesh. You are my daughter. The Bible commands us to honor our father and mother. It commands us to forgive those who trespass against us. You cannot hand your own flesh and blood over to the federal government. You cannot throw your own father into a concrete cell. A daughter must respect the man who gave her life. We are family, Iman. In times of crisis, family must stick together. Family must protect each other. I let his words hang in the silent air of the penthouse. I let the sheer suffocating hypocrisy of his plea wash over me. He stood there quoting scripture, weaponizing the very concept of family he had used as a bludgeon against me for 28 years. He expected me to yield to the title of father, a title he had never truly earned, only exploited. My expression did not soften. My posture did not relax. I tilted my head, studying him with the detached curiosity of a scientist examining a dying insect. You were not quoting the Bible when you told the country club security to throw me out. I stated, my voice slicing through his religious performance with icy surgical precision. Desmond froze, his outstretched hands dropping slightly. I remember it perfectly, Desmond. I continued, stepping forward and closing the distance between us, forcing him to look directly into my eyes. I was 22 years old. I had just secured my first minor seed funding, and I came to the club to celebrate with you. I walked into the main dining room wearing a dress I bought off a clearance rack, and you looked at me like I was a stray dog tracking mud onto your expensive carpets. You did not offer me a seat. You did not offer me a glass of water. You called over the head of security and told him that a non-member was loitering in the dining room. You stood there and watched two grown men grab my arms and physically escort me out the back service doors, all because my presence was embarrassing your wealthy investors. Vivica sniffled on this couch, refusing to look up. Desmond swallowed hard, his throat clicking in the silence. You did not care about blood then, I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal hum that vibrated through the floorboards. You did not care about family when you let Vivica lock me out of the main house during the holidays. You did not care about honoring your daughter when you tried to steal 30% of my company with a fraudulent contract. Do not dare stand in my penthouse and quote scripture to me, Desmond. You have no religion. You have no morals. You only respect power. I paused, letting the absolute truth of the statement crush whatever remained of his patriarchal delusion. Well, look at me, I commanded, my voice echoing like thunder in the cavernous room. Look at the woman you threw away. Look at the daughter you deemed unworthy of your precious legacy. I am the power now. Desmond's shoulders slumped. The remaining fight drained out of him entirely. He looked down at his expensive shoes, unable to hold my gaze for a second longer. He was broken. The titan of Atlanta real estate was nothing but dust. But I was not finished. The demolition was complete, but the cleanup was about to begin. I turned my back on Desmond, dismissing him completely, and addressed the entire room. My voice was sharp, authoritative, and completely devoid of mercy. This is how the next 24 hours of your lives will play out, I announced, ensuring every single syllable landed with maximum impact. Sterling has already drafted the transfer deeds for the Buckhead estate. You will sign them, Desmond. You will surrender the property to my holding company by noon tomorrow to cover the debts you owe me. You will pack exactly 2 suitcases each. You will leave the cars, the jewelry, and the artwork. You will walk out the front door, and you will never set foot on that property again. Vivica let out a sharp, devastated wail, clutching her chest as if she had been shot. As for your legal troubles, I continued, ignoring her completely. I have already sent the decrypted ledgers of Preston's firm to the Securities and Exchange Commission. The offshore routing numbers, the doctored church tax returns, and the embezzlement records are currently sitting in the inbox of a federal prosecutor. The authorities will be knocking on your door by the end of the week. I highly suggest you use whatever spare change you have hidden in your couch cushions to hire a criminal defense attorney. I walked over to the private elevator, pressing the call button. The polished steel doors slid open immediately. You came here demanding a bailout, I said, looking at the miserable, broken people occupying my floor. You came here demanding my money, my equity, and my submission. Instead, you are leaving with exactly what you gave me all those years ago. Absolutely nothing. Now get out of my house before I have my security team escort you through the service elevator. Desmond did not argue. Vivica did not protest. Sydney did not beg. They picked themselves up from the floor, moving like ghosts, broken and utterly defeated, and slowly walked toward the open elevator doors. The heavy, polished steel doors of the private elevator hummed to life, but they did not open. Instead, a sharp electronic buzz echoed through the foyer, accompanied by the angry red flash of the security keypad. Sterling slowly lowered his tablet, his thumb resting casually over the screen. The escape route was officially sealed. Preston, who had been frantically pushing the call button in the dark vestibule for the past 10 minutes, realizing he was trapped without a biometric keycard, shrank back against the marble wall. He was sweating profusely. His designer collar completely soaked his chest, heaving with mounting panic. A wide shot captured the sheer scale of the penthouse, gliding smoothly across the expansive room to frame the absolute disparity of power. I stood dead center in the massive living space, perfectly still, dramatically backlit by the glittering, sprawling Atlanta skyline. The towering illuminated skyscrapers outside the floor-to-ceiling windows framed me like a modern monarch, mirroring my own unyielding, untouchable posture. Below me, illuminated by the harsh modern lighting of the foyer, the four family members cowered on my expensive custom Persian rugs. The Adams dynasty, once the absolute terror of the Southern elite, was now nothing but a huddled, shivering mass of ruined silk and shattered egos. "I told you to leave," I said, my voice cutting through the stifling, heavy silence with absolute icy precision. "But we are going to establish the exact terms of your departure before these doors unlock. You are not going to slink away and formulate a counterattack. You are not going to call your lawyers. You are going to choose your fate right here, right now on my floor." I took a single measured step forward, the sharp click of my heels sounding like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Here are your choices," I declared, staring down at the pathetic figures before me. Option 1. You leave this penthouse right now, hand over the keys to my house, and disappear. You never mention my name again, and you figure out your own mess with the SEC and the IRS. I let the weight of that option settle over them. I watched Vivica's throat work as she swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously toward the locked elevator. Option 2. I continued, gesturing gracefully toward Sterling. You stay and argue, and Sterling hits send on this email, delivering every piece of evidence to the authorities. The photographs of Vivica, the doctored church tax returns, Desmond's forged signatures, and Preston's fake corporate filings will go directly to the federal prosecutors and every major media outlet in the state simultaneously. You will not just lose your wealth, you will be wearing handcuffs before the sun comes up. The silence that followed was physically suffocating. It was a heavy, toxic quiet broken only by the sound of Sydney's ragged, shallow breathing. I watched the brutal internal battle wage across their faces. It was a vicious war between their lifelong addiction to greed and their basic primal instinct for self-preservation. Desmond's jaw clenched so tightly, I thought his teeth might crack his eyes, darting frantically around the room as if searching for a legal loophole that simply did not exist. Vivica bit her lip until it bled, her mind visibly calculating if she had any hidden favors she could call in any powerful friends left in her social circle to manipulate. Sydney just stared blindly at the floor, totally paralyzed by the realization that her life as a wealthy, pampered socialite was permanently over. To hand over the keys was to accept total, absolute poverty. It was a reality their aristocratic brains could not process. They hesitated a second too long. Their arrogance was a terminal disease. But Preston had seen enough. The illusion of the untouchable Addams family had been completely, thoroughly shattered, and his survival instinct violently kicked in. He was a corporate parasite, and he knew the host was officially dead. Preston let out a strangled, pathetic sob and broke. He scrambled forward on his hands and knees, completely ignoring the horrified gasp from his wife. He crawled across the vintage Persian rug, his expensive suit trousers catching on the woven fabric, until he reached the heavy glass coffee table. "I will take option 1. Preston babbled, his voice a frantic, high-pitched whine that stripped him of whatever dignity he had left. His hands shook so violently that he could barely reach into his pocket. He pulled out a heavy keyring and slammed it down onto the glass surface. The metal clattered loudly, breaking the spell over the room. "Those are the keys to the Buckhead estate, the codes to the gates, the alarm fobs, everything. I am done. I want out." Sydney stared at him, her tear-streaked face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated disbelief. "Preston," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of his immediate betrayal. "What are you doing? You are my husband." Preston did not even look at her. He kept his wide, terrified eyes fixed entirely on me, pleading like a cornered animal begging for its life. "I had nothing to do with the church embezzlement," he practically screamed, throwing Desmond and Vivica under the bus without a single second of hesitation. "I only did what Desmond told me to do with the corporate accounts. I was just following orders to keep my job. Please, Iman, just let me walk out of here. I will sign whatever you want. I will leave Sydney. I will file for divorce tomorrow morning. Just do not send those files to the SEC, please. Desmond let out a roar of absolute outrage, lunging toward his son-in-law, his hands reaching out to strangle the man who had just sold them all out to save his own skin. Desmond lunged forward with a guttural, furious roar, his large hands grasping at empty air as Preston scrambled backward with the desperate, frantic agility of a cornered rat. The younger man did not even attempt to defend his father-in-law, nor did he make a single move to comfort his weeping wife. His entire existence had instantly narrowed down to one overriding, primal objective: absolute self-preservation. Our visual focus locked onto Preston, executing a seamless, relentless tracking shot that followed his panicked retreat across the expansive room. He practically tripped over his own expensive leather shoes, gasping for air as he scrambled to his feet. He did not look back at the wreckage of his marriage or the shattered criminal remains of his in-laws. Instead, he violently yanked at his left hand. The heavy custom-designed gold wedding band slid off his finger with brutal finality. He hurled it directly onto the polished hardwood floor, the metal bouncing and spinning away with a sharp, hollow clatter that echoed above the chaos. "You are entirely on your own, Sydney," Preston shouted, his voice a high, reedy pitch of absolute terror that stripped him of whatever corporate dignity he had left. "I am not going to federal prison to cover for your family's psychotic delusions." He spun around and bolted toward the private elevator, aggressively mashing the call button with a trembling fist. Sydney finally snapped out of her paralyzed state. A sound of pure, unadulterated terror ripped from her throat. She scrambled across the vintage Persian rug, her designer silk dress bunching awkwardly around her knees, completely abandoning every ounce of aristocratic grace she had spent a lifetime cultivating. She reached out, her manicured fingers clawing at the empty air as she desperately dragged herself toward the foyer. "Preston, wait!" she screamed, her voice cracking under the agonizing weight of his total immediate betrayal. "You cannot just leave me here. You are my husband." But Preston simply took a deliberate step backward into the elevator car. He stared at her with blank, uncaring eyes as the heavy steel doors smoothly slid shut right in her face, sealing him safely inside and leaving her sobbing hysterically against the cold, unyielding metal barrier. A few feet away, Vivica was violently shivering, attempting to collect the shredded, pathetic remains of her dignity. The imperious, untouchable matriarch, who had commanded country club ballrooms and charity galas for decades, was completely gone. Her meticulous, expensive makeup was a smeared, dark mess, and her breathing was reduced to a series of ragged, shallow gasps. She did not look at her husband, the man whose freedom she had casually jeopardized to fund her own vanity and secret affairs. She scrambled across the floor, frantically snatching up her scattered belongings. Her hands locked onto her bright orange Birkin bag, a bag that in the harsh, unforgiving light of her current financial reality suddenly looked exactly like the cheap, desperate counterfeit of a life she had been living. She hoisted herself up on shaking legs, smoothing down the front of her ruined dress, and hobbled toward the secondary exit. She did not spare a single glance for her weeping daughter on the floor. She simply fled, a coward running blindly from the catastrophic, inescapable consequences of her own boundless greed. I remained standing perfectly still, bathed in the cool light of the city skyline, pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I watched them scramble. I watched them tear each other apart without a second thought. "It is truly fascinating," I said, my voice cutting through Sydney's pathetic, muffled sobs with icy, deliberate precision. "You spent my entire life preaching about the unbreakable bonds of the Addams dynasty. You hosted exclusive galas, you smiled brightly for the society pages, and you looked down on anyone who did not share your supposedly superior bloodline. You called me an embarrassment to the family name because I refused to play my assigned role in your endless charade. But look at you now." I took a slow, measured step forward, ensuring my words blanketed the empty space of the room. "You paraded your high society connections like a titanium shield." I continued, my tone flat and unyielding. "You built a fortress of arrogance, convinced that your wealth made you fundamentally better, fundamentally stronger than the rest of the world. But the absolute second the money disappears, the moment the status is genuinely threatened, the illusion shatters. Your perfect family bonds break faster than cheap glass. You devour each other. The husband abandons the wife to save his own skin. The mother abandons the daughter to run from her own crimes. There is no loyalty here. There never was. You traded genuine human connection for a hollow performance, and now the curtain has permanently fallen. Sydney realized Preston was not coming back. She pushed herself up from the floor, her face a bloated mask of total devastation, and stumbled blindly toward the emergency stairwell, pushing through the heavy fire doors and disappearing into the echoing concrete shaft. Vivica had already slipped away, vanishing into the night to face her impending federal indictments and public humiliation alone. The chaotic noise of their frantic exodus slowly faded away, replaced by the heavy, suffocating silence of the penthouse. Desmond was the last one left standing. The great, imposing patriarch of the Addams family stood completely frozen in the center of my living room. His broad shoulders were slumped, his chest hollow, his entire commanding frame reduced to a brittle broken shell. He slowly turned his head, his bloodshot eyes dragging upward to meet my gaze. He stared at me standing tall, wealthy, completely independent, and absolutely untouchable. The horrific realization physically settled over his features, pulling his face into an expression of profound, inescapable despair. He had spent decades protecting parasites. He had sacrificed, alienated, and actively destroyed his relationship with his only truly brilliant, capable child, all for a pack of wolves who abandoned him the absolute second the bank accounts ran dry. The invisible lens of the room shifted, settling into a tight over-the-shoulder perspective from my vantage point. It framed the back of my perfectly tailored suit, looking down past my shoulder at the hollowed-out shell of a man who used to be my father. The distance between us was only a few feet, but it might as well have been a chasm of 1,000 miles. I watched him closely as the camera of my own perception slowly pushed in, magnifying every line of defeat etched into his face. His mouth opened closed and then opened again. The arrogant, booming baritone that had commanded boardrooms and terrified subordinates for decades was completely gone, replaced by a dry, raspy wheeze. "Are you really going to let us be homeless?" Desmond whispered, his voice cracking on the final syllable. He looked up at me, his eyes swimming with desperate, unshed tears, begging for a reprieve he had never once offered me. "Your own flesh and blood." I did not blink. I did not shift my weight. I let the pathetic echo of his plea die against the cold, expensive glass of the floor-to-ceiling windows. I looked at the man who had spent my entire life making me feel small, ensuring I knew I was an outsider, a secondary citizen in his kingdom of wealth. He was trying to invoke a biological technicality to save himself from the absolute ruin he had engineered. "You told me to try Uber when I needed a ride from the hospital 5 years ago," I stated, my voice as smooth and unforgiving as polished marble. Desmond physically flinched, his shoulders jerking as if I had struck him across the face with a heavy chain. I remember the freezing rain that night. I continued stepping into his personal space, forcing him to absorb the absolute zero temperature of my words. I had just been discharged. I had no money, no winter coat, and nowhere to go. My phone was dying. I called you begging for a fraction of the compassion you so freely lavished on Preston and Sydney. I begged my own flesh and blood for a simple ride home. You sighed heavily into the receiver. You told me you were hosting an important dinner party for your investors, that my timing was inconvenient. And then you said the words I have used as dark-burning fuel every single day since. You said try Uber. I tilted my head, offering him a smile entirely devoid of warmth, a predator baring its teeth. "I suggest you open the app, Desmond," I said softly. "Surge pricing is high tonight." The last remaining flicker of hope extinguished in his bloodshot eyes. The realization that there were no second chances, no hidden reserves of familial mercy finally broke him. His gaze dropped to the floor, staring blankly at the discarded wedding ring his cowardly son-in-law had left behind. I raised my hand just an inch. Standing by the marble console, Sterling caught the subtle movement. He did not say a single word. He simply raised two fingers toward the darkened corridor leading to the private service wing of the penthouse. From the deep shadows, two massive men in immaculate tailored black suits stepped forward. My private security detail moved with the silent, lethal efficiency of apex predators. They crossed the vintage rug, their heavy boots making absolutely no sound, their expressions blank masks of professional intimidation. Desmond did not fight them. When the first guard clamped a massive hand down on his shoulder, the former patriarch of the Addams family simply yielded, his legs trembling so violently he could barely support his own body weight. Near the secondary exit, Vivica was still frozen. She had tried to flee moments ago, but the terrifying reality of stepping out of the penthouse and into a world where she possessed absolutely nothing had paralyzed her. She was clutching her fake Birkin bag to her chest, like a life preserver, weeping openly, the heavy mascara running in dark, jagged rivulets down her perfectly lifted cheeks. The second guard approached her, gripping her elbow with a firm, unmistakable pressure. She let out a soft, pathetic wail, but she did not resist. Her aristocratic pride had been entirely incinerated. They were both completely broken, reduced to the status of common vagrants. I stood motionless, my hands clasped loosely behind my back, watching the procession. The two guards physically escorted the weeping, stumbling couple across the expansive foyer. Desmond dragged his feet, his head bowed, his broad shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Vivica leaned heavily against the guard, her crying echoing off the high modern ceilings. They looked exactly like what they were, trespassers being forcefully removed from a kingdom they had arrogantly tried to steal. The guards guided them toward the main entrance of the penthouse. Sterling stepped forward, his posture rigid and formal, and gripped the brass handles of the heavy, solid oak double doors. He pulled them open, revealing the brightly lit, sterile hallway of the building's top floor. The guards pushed Desmond and Vivica over the threshold. They stumbled out onto the generic hallway carpeting, stripped of their power, their legacy, their stolen dignity, and their home. Sterling looked at them one last time, his expression radiating a cold, polite contempt, and then he grabbed the heavy brass handles. He pulled the doors shut. The heavy oak slammed into its frame with a booming, thunderous finality. The sound reverberated through the floorboards, ringing out like the strike of an executioner's gavel. The heavy mechanical deadbolts engaged with a sharp metallic click, permanently locking them out of my world. The sudden silence in the penthouse was absolute. It rushed in to fill the massive space, instantly swallowing the residual echoes of Vivica's weeping and Desmond's frantic bargaining. I stood alone in the center of the room, bathed in the glow of the glittering Atlanta skyline and surrounded by imported luxury. Sterling stepped back to his post, a silent sentinel perfectly blending into the background. The silence was deafening. It pressed against the glass, heavy and profound, ringing in my ears after the chaotic storm of the last hour. But as I took a deep, steadying breath of the cool, conditioned air, I realized it was not a lonely silence. It was not the isolating quiet of a woman who had just lost her family. It was the silence of a battlefield after the smoke has cleared and the enemy has unconditionally surrendered. It was the silence of a debt fully paid, of a lifelong wound, finally cauterized and permanently sealed. It was the silence of absolute, undeniable victory. The silence stretched perfect and pristine, the camera acting as the invisible observer detached from its fixed position near the foyer. It began a slow, continuous orbit around me. I stood there for a few seconds longer, savoring the absolute absence of their suffocating presence. The scent of Desmond's expensive, arrogant cologne was already dissipating, replaced by the clean, sharp air of my own domain. I turned my back on the locked oak doors. I did not look over my shoulder. There was nothing left back there but ghosts and shattered egos. I walked across the room, my heels sinking slightly into the thick, luxurious pile of the custom Persian rug. The camera tracked my movement, gliding seamlessly beside me as I moved toward the plush velvet sofa. This was the exact spot where the evening had begun, the center of my sanctuary. The room felt infinitely lighter now. For 28 years, I had carried the invisible, crushing weight of their expectations, their conditional love, and their relentless demands. It was a heavy, suffocating armor I had worn every single day. Now I was entirely unburdened. I reached down to the heavy glass coffee table. The crystal tumbler of bourbon rested exactly where I had left it before the invasion. Condensation had formed on the outside of the glass, catching the ambient light of the room. I picked it up, the cool, solid weight of the crystal, grounding me in the present moment. I walked past the velvet sofa, moving toward the expansive wall of floor-to-ceiling windows. The camera followed smoothly, arching around my back to capture the breathtaking panoramic view. The glittering skyline of Atlanta stretched out before me, a magnificent sea of diamonds and gold against the black velvet sky. Millions of lights pulsed in the darkness, representing power, ambition, and relentless momentum. The ribbon of the interstate glowed with red and white streaks, a constant flow of life moving forward. I looked out over the city that had once felt so impossibly huge, so completely dominated by the Adams legacy. Desmond used to stand in his own office looking down at these very streets, claiming he owned the world. He owned nothing. He was merely a tenant in a kingdom of paper and fraud. I took a slow breath, letting the reality of my actions settle deep into my bones. Society dictates that we must forgive our blood. The world demands that daughters yield to their fathers, that sisters protect their siblings, that family is an unbreakable, sacred covenant, regardless of the abuse inflicted. I felt absolutely none of that. I searched my heart for a single ounce of guilt, a fleeting whisper of remorse. There was nothing. The space where familial obligation used to reside was completely clean. It was a surgical removal. The toxic tumor that had been actively poisoning my life, my self-worth, and my peace of mind had been expertly excised. I had cut them out, cauterized the wound, and the healing was instantaneous. They had come into my home demanding submission. They expected the girl who used to cry in her bedroom after being humiliated at country club dinners. They expected the daughter who begged for a scrap of validation. They completely underestimated the woman who had clawed her way to the top of the tech industry, a woman who had learned to weaponize her own pain. I did not just defeat them, I dismantled the entire foundation of their reality. Desmond would face the morning with nothing but the clothes on his back and the terrifying certainty of a federal indictment. Vivica would be forced to navigate a world where her last name carried no weight and her credit cards bounced. Preston was a coward on the run, and Sydney would finally have to learn what it felt like to be truly abandoned. The empire they used to bludgeon me into submission was now my personal property. The camera continued its smooth, unbroken arc, finally coming to rest directly in front of me, zooming in to a tight, intimate close-up. The reflection of the city lights danced in my eyes. I held the camera's gaze, stripping away any remaining pretense. My voice, when I finally spoke, was calm, resonant, and laced with absolute certainty. They spent my entire life telling me I was useless, telling me I didn't fit into their pristine, perfect world. I paused, letting the truth of those words hang in the air. They were absolutely right. I didn't fit into their world because I was busy buying it. Sometimes the most beautiful thing you can build with your life is a locked door. I raised the crystal glass. The amber liquid caught the city lights one last time. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the bourbon, relishing the smoky, rich burn as it slid down my throat. I lowered the glass, looking directly into the lens, and offered a slow, sharp, triumphant smirk.